Margaret's days had blurred into a monotony she had long since resigned herself to. Her mornings began with the familiar hum of her alarm clock, followed by a cup of black coffee sipped in silence at the kitchen table. She would skim the newspaper, fold it neatly, and head out for her errands. For years, she had lived this way, her life a collection of routines that demanded little of her heart or imagination. At 54, she had grown accustomed to the quiet. Her children had long since moved out, their laughter and chaos replaced by the faint creak of the house settling in the evenings. Divorced for nearly a decade, Margaret had stopped looking for love. She convinced herself she didn't need it, didn't miss it. Her life was fine, calm, predictable, and unremarkable. It was on an ordinary Tuesday, during one of her weekly grocery runs, that the spark appeared. She was in the produce section, debating the ripeness of a cantaloupe, when she heard a voice behind her. If you knock on it and it sounds hollow, it's usually a good one. Startled, Margaret turned to see a man standing a few feet away, holding a basket filled with oranges and spinach. He was younger, she guessed early 30s, and had an easy smile that immediately disarmed her. His sandy hair was slightly tousled, and there was an earnestness in his blue eyes that caught her off guard. "Oh," she said, holding the cantaloupe awkwardly. "I didn't know that. Thank you." He stepped closer, gently tapping on a nearby melon. "Like this?" He handed it to her, and their hands brushed for a moment. Margaret felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name, a sensation she hadn't felt in years. "Looks like you're an expert," she said, trying to steady her voice. "Not really," he replied with a laugh. "My mom taught me. She's a big fan of cantaloupe." Margaret smiled, placing the fruit in her cart. "Well, I'll trust your expertise. I'm Ryan, by the way," he said, extending his hand. "Margaret," she replied, shaking it briefly. His grip was firm but warm, and she found herself holding his gaze a moment longer than she intended. They exchanged a few more words, small talk about the unpredictable weather and the rising cost of groceries before parting ways. Margaret continued her shopping, her thoughts strangely scattered. She noticed him again at the checkout line, where he gave her a quick wave before disappearing into the parking lot. Driving home, Margaret replayed the encounter in her mind. It had been such a small, fleeting moment, but it left her feeling unexpectedly alive, as if someone had opened a window in her carefully sealed world. For the first time in a long while, she caught herself smiling. Margaret didn't expect to see Ryan again. The grocery store was a revolving door of faces, and yet, when she returned the following week, there he was. This time, he was in the bread aisle, inspecting a loaf of sourdough. "Let me guess," she said as she approached, her voice tinged with playful sarcasm. "Your mom taught you how to pick the perfect loaf, too?" Ryan looked up, his grin as wide as she remembered. "Not sourdough. That's all me." He held the bread out dramatically as if it were a rare treasure. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, as if they were old acquaintances reconnecting after years apart. She learned that Ryan worked as a graphic designer, freelancing from home to escape the chaos of office life. He asked about her life, and she shared small glimpses. How she spent most of her time gardening or reading, how she was learning to bake but hadn't yet mastered it. "I'll trade you a good sourdough for a gardening lesson," he said, his tone light but genuine. Margaret laughed. "Deal. But don't hold your breath. I kill more plants than I grow." What might have been another passing interaction turned into an exchange of numbers when Ryan insisted he send her a foolproof sourdough recipe. She accepted hesitantly, unsure what she was inviting into her life but curious enough not to let the moment slip away. Over the next few weeks, Ryan became a small but consistent presence in Margaret's life. At first, it was just texts about recipes or gardening tips, but soon their exchanges deepened. He sent her a photo of a failed bread experiment, and she countered with a snapshot of her sunflowers, blooming wildly in her yard. When they bumped into each other at the store again, it felt less like coincidence and more like fate. He invited her to grab coffee at a small cafe nearby, and though her instinct was to decline, she found herself saying yes. At the cafe, Ryan surprised her with his curiosity. He didn't just ask polite questions. He wanted to know her favorite childhood memory, the last movie she cried over, the most ridiculous thing she'd ever done. Margaret answered cautiously at first, but his laughter and sincerity were contagious. She told him about sneaking into a drive-in theater with her best friend as a teenager and how she'd once stayed up all night baking cookies to cheer her daughter up after a bad breakup. Ryan listened intently, his gaze unwavering, and Margaret couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at her that way. As they walked back to their cars, he turned to her and said, "You're fun, Margaret. You know that." She scoffed, brushing off the compliment with a laugh. But later that evening, as she sat alone in her kitchen, his words lingered. It had been years since anyone had called her fun. She'd almost forgotten that part of herself existed. Yet somehow Ryan had seen it, and for the first time in a long time, she felt seen. Margaret awoke one morning with an unusual lightness, as though something in her had shifted. She brewed her coffee and stepped out into her garden, the early sunlight casting a soft glow on the flowers she tended so meticulously. Normally, this solitude comforted her, but today it felt incomplete. She caught herself thinking about Ryan. Over the weeks, their friendship had blossomed in ways she hadn't anticipated. They shared jokes, exchanged ideas, and even planned to tackle her overgrown vegetable patch together. Each interaction left her energized, her cheeks hurting from the smiles he effortlessly drew from her. Yet, as she replayed a moment from their most recent conversation, a casual compliment he'd given her, she felt her chest tighten. "You have the best laugh," he'd said, his eyes alight with genuine warmth. It had seemed harmless at the time, but now the memory stirred something deeper. Margaret closed her eyes, trying to brush the feeling aside. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to herself. But it wasn't ridiculous. The truth crept up on her in quiet moments. While sorting through old photos of her daughter, while reading a novel and finding herself comparing the fictional hero's charm to Ryan's, and especially in the silences, those spaces where her mind wandered to him unbidden. One afternoon, as they worked together in her garden, the realization hit her with startling clarity. Ryan was kneeling in the soil, sleeves rolled up, laughter spilling freely as he recounted a mishap at his latest art exhibit. Margaret caught herself staring, not at his hands or his youthful energy, but at his expression, the way he seemed so fully alive. Her heart ached, not with the sharp pang of loss or regret, but with the sweet, terrifying pang of longing. Margaret tried to shake it off, but the more she tried to convince herself it was nothing, the more undeniable it became. She hadn't felt this way in years, not since her husband, before the distance had crept in and they'd grown apart long before his passing. Later that evening, she sat in her living room, sipping tea and staring at the framed photos on the mantel. Her family, her life. She was a 54-year-old widow, a mother, a woman with a past full of responsibilities and sacrifices. And Ryan was what? A friend? An anomaly? The thought of her feelings being anything more than friendship filled her with shame and confusion. "What would people say?" she whispered aloud, her voice breaking. "What would he think?" But no matter how much she tried to silence the voice within her, the truth lingered, a stubborn presence she couldn't ignore. Ryan made her feel alive again, and for the first time in years, she realized she wanted more. The realization terrified her as much as it thrilled her. This wasn't a script she could follow. It was uncharted territory, and she wasn't sure if her heart was strong enough to take the risk. The days following Margaret's realization were a blur of conflicting emotions. Each time her phone buzzed with a message from Ryan, her heart leapt, followed by a pang of guilt. She read his texts carefully, searching for hidden meanings that probably weren't there. "What are you doing this weekend? Need help with the garden?" The words felt innocent on the surface, but her mind twisted them into possibilities. Did he feel something, too? Or was this friendship entirely one-sided? Margaret began avoiding the grocery store where they'd met. Walking those aisles without running into him felt safer, like a way to preserve the friendship while keeping her feelings at bay. But even at home, she found no escape. Every quiet moment was filled with thoughts of Ryan, his smile, his voice, his easy kindness. Late one night, unable to sleep, Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her face was marked with lines of time, her hair threaded with gray. She reached up, touching her cheek lightly. "Why would he even look at me that way?" she whispered, her voice tinged with self-doubt. The answer was clear, he didn't. Margaret tried to remind herself of reality. Ryan was young, full of promise, with an entire future ahead of him. She was decades older, carrying the weight of a life already lived, of mistakes made, of a heart broken and pieced back together too many times. But then, why did he linger after their garden projects, asking questions about her life with genuine curiosity? Why did he laugh so hard at her stories, even the silly ones she thought no one cared about? Her thoughts spiraled, veering from hope to despair. She worried about how people would judge her if they knew. A woman in her 50s, falling for a man barely in his 30s? Society had no kind words for people like her. She could almost hear the whispers, desperate, foolish, trying to cling to youth. The fear of judgment clashed with another, quieter voice in her mind, the one that reminded her of the joy Ryan brought to her life. Was it so wrong to crave happiness, even if it came in an unconventional form? Margaret confided in no one. Not her closest friends, not her daughter, not even the journal she'd once used to sort her thoughts. She couldn't bear to see the truth written down. Instead, she threw herself into distractions. She cleaned the house until it sparkled. She reorganized her bookshelves. She joined a pottery class, though her heart wasn't in it. But no matter what she did, she couldn't erase Ryan from her thoughts. One afternoon, while sipping tea in her sunlit kitchen, she let herself imagine the impossible. What if she could tell him? What if he understood? The thought made her pulse race, but it was quickly followed by a crushing wave of doubt. Her eyes filled with tears she didn't even realize were coming. The truth was simple but heavy. She had spent so long being careful, playing by the rules, and putting others first. Now, faced with a chance at something real, something that could be beautiful or disastrous, she didn't know if she had the courage to take it. Margaret wiped her tears and resolved to make a decision soon. Living in this limbo was unbearable. She had to choose whether to take a leap or let go of the feelings threatening to consume her. But how could she risk ruining what they had? And yet, how could she live with herself if she didn't try? The decision had been made, but it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into an abyss of uncertainty. Margaret spent the next few days circling the idea of inviting Ryan to her home. Each time the thought crossed her mind, a different wave of anxiety swept over her. What would he think? Was she being too forward? Would this ruin the comfortable rhythm they'd built? Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was a necessary step. Something inside her told her that the space between them, though filled with warmth and shared laughter, was too wide. She wanted to see him, really see him, beyond the fleeting encounters, the glances exchanged in a bustling cafe or while tending to the flowers in her garden. She needed him to understand the part of her that had long been dormant. Maybe, just maybe, he was someone who could fill the emptiness she'd become so accustomed to. That Friday evening, as she stood in the kitchen, preparing dinner for herself, something simple as usual, she finally composed a message to him. She took a deep breath before hitting send. "Hey Ryan, I was wondering if you'd be up for coming over tomorrow evening. I was thinking of cooking something nice, and I'd love to have you join me." Her fingers lingered on the phone screen, nerves pulsing through her body as she waited for his response. Each second felt like an eternity. She kept telling herself it was just a casual invitation. Nothing more. She wasn't looking for anything dramatic. But then why did her heart race with anticipation? When the message pinged back, she nearly dropped the phone. Ryan's response was quick, casual, and filled with warmth. "That sounds great. I'd love to. What time should I come over?" She smiled, but the smile was shaky, unsure. As she set the phone down, she let herself breathe, a little laugh escaping her lips. She had done it. Now came the hard part, making it through the evening without her nerves getting the best of her. The next evening, Margaret found herself pacing around her living room, tidying up obsessively, though there was little to tidy. She kept glancing at the clock, willing time to slow down, then speed up, then slow again. The house, usually quiet and still, was suddenly filled with nervous energy. She hadn't prepared for this kind of anticipation in years, and the feelings, confusion, excitement, fear, were unfamiliar but undeniable. When the doorbell rang, her heart jumped to her throat. She opened the door to find Ryan standing there, holding a bottle of wine in one hand and a bouquet of fresh lilies in the other. Her breath caught in her chest. He looked effortlessly charming, his easy smile lighting up his face. "Hi," he said softly, his eyes warm as he stepped inside. "I wasn't sure what flowers you'd like, so I just grabbed what looked nice." His voice was light, But there was something deeper there, something that made her wonder if he could sense the quiet intensity in the air between them. Margaret smiled and reached for the bouquet, her fingers brushing his briefly. The moment was brief, but it was enough to send a surge of warmth through her. "Thank you," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "These are beautiful. Please come in." The evening unfolded as it always did when they were together, easy conversation, laughter, and shared moments of connection. But this time, there was a different undercurrent. As they sat at the small dining table, the flicker of candlelight casting shadows on their faces, Margaret felt a quiet tension building. Every word he spoke seemed to linger in the air longer than it should. Every laugh they shared felt richer, deeper. There was a point after dessert when she realized she was no longer thinking about the dinner or the company. She was simply thinking about him. How he made her feel seen, appreciated, alive in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. His presence wasn't just comforting, it was intoxicating. And as the evening wore on, Margaret couldn't shake the thought that this could be more than a fleeting connection. She wasn't just yearning for companionship, she was yearning for him. The conversation turned to more personal topics, past relationships, dreams, and even regrets. They spoke with an ease that surprised her, as if they had known each other much longer than they actually had. Ryan's eyes softened when he spoke of his dreams. "I've always wanted to do more than just the ordinary. I don't know what it is yet, but I can feel it waiting for me, just beyond the horizon." Margaret looked at him, searching his face as if she could find the answers to her own questions in the depths of his eyes. She wanted to ask him about his feelings, to probe the space between them, and see if it could hold more than just casual friendship. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she smiled. "I think sometimes the best things in life are the ones we don't plan for," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Ryan smiled back, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other, the silence between them thick and full of unspoken possibilities. It was then that Margaret realized with a quiet certainty that this, whatever it was more than just a chance encounter. She had taken a risk tonight by inviting him into her life, but she didn't regret it. It was one of the few times in years she had allowed herself to believe that something could be more than just ordinary. The evening ended all too soon. As Ryan left, he kissed her cheek softly, and she froze for a moment, heart hammering in her chest. The simple gesture, one of affection and tenderness, held so much weight. As she closed the door behind him, Margaret's mind raced. Was this the beginning of something new? Something unexpected? She didn't know for sure, but in her heart, she couldn't help but feel that this was just the start of a new chapter, one that she hadn't been expecting. But now that it had begun, she wasn't sure she wanted it to end. The days that followed felt like a quiet, building crescendo. The humdrum of Margaret's life had subtly shifted after Ryan's visit. Each time her phone buzzed with a message from him, a small thrill would spark within her, a warmth spreading through her chest. They had fallen into an easy rhythm, messages in the morning, a phone call or two in the evening, and weekend visits that seemed to stretch longer and longer as the days passed. But it was the evening Ryan came back to her home, not just for another meal but for something more, a real connection. Stripped of the walls she'd built around herself, that everything changed. This time, when the doorbell rang, Margaret wasn't just anticipating a friendly face. She was waiting for the person who had, in a few short weeks, become something more. She opened the door to find him standing there, wearing the same smile that always made her feel lighter, yet somehow there was something more in his eyes. Tonight, there was no playful banter, no casual small talk. It was different. His gaze seemed more knowing, more present. "Hey," he greeted softly, his voice warm but with an edge of something else, something deeper. His hands held nothing this time. No flowers, no wine, just the quiet certainty that, perhaps, tonight wasn't about what they had but what they could become. Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat, her heart racing just slightly. "Hi," she replied, trying to maintain composure, though her words betrayed the soft tremble in her voice. They didn't speak much after that. They simply moved into the kitchen together, preparing the meal as they had done before. But the air between them was thick with a kind of unspoken tension. As the evening wore on, their usual banter seemed to fade away, replaced by deeper, slower conversations that drifted beyond the casual. At one point, while they were eating dessert, A quiet lull fell between them. Ryan leaned back in his chair, his eyes lingering on her as though he were studying her in a way that made Margaret feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. He cleared his throat, a little awkwardly, before speaking. "I've been thinking about something," he began, his voice soft yet clear. Margaret looked up from her dessert, her eyes meeting his. The way he was looking at her, intensely but tenderly, made her heart stutter. "About us," he continued, his gaze not wavering. "I don't know if I'm crazy, or if you feel the same way, but I think there's something here. Something real." Her breath caught, and for a moment, her world stopped. His words were simple, but their weight was undeniable. She had felt it, felt the shift, the connection that seemed to grow stronger every time they spent time together. But hearing him say it out loud made it real. It made it tangible. "I don't know if it's crazy," she whispered, her voice raw with vulnerability. "But I feel it too." The admission hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Margaret's mind reeled with the implications. She was in her 50s, and here she was, sitting with a man who was nearly half her age, admitting that she wanted more. Her mind raced, memories of judgment, whispers of what people might say, all flooded her thoughts. But when she looked into Ryan's eyes, none of that mattered. She had spent years telling herself that love, real love, was for the young, for those whose lives hadn't yet been set in their ways. She had convinced herself that at her age, such feelings were a luxury, something to be relegated to the past. But here he was, this man who was young enough to be her son. And yet, when he looked at her, he saw her, truly saw her. The fear and doubt that she had lived with for so long slowly began to melt away in that moment. They were two people, not defined by their age, but by the simple fact that they had found something in each other that couldn't be dismissed by time or convention. Margaret leaned in slightly, her hand resting on the table between them, almost as if she were testing the waters. Ryan mirrored her movement, his hand coming to rest next to hers. The touch was gentle at first, cautious, as though neither of them wanted to rush the inevitable. But when their fingers finally brushed, it was as though the air around them shifted. The touch wasn't just a casual greeting. It was an invitation, a promise, a silent agreement that whatever this was, it was real. Ryan's voice broke the quiet tension between them. "Do you want this?" he asked, his voice so soft, so vulnerable, that it made her heart ache. Margaret's gaze locked with his. She could feel her breath steadying, her heartbeat in her throat. She had been so afraid of this moment, of the feelings that it stirred in her, but now that it had arrived, she couldn't deny it. "Yes," she breathed. The word was simple, but it held the weight of years of longing and self-doubt. It was a declaration that she wasn't going to let fear dictate her choices any longer. And just like that, the space between them narrowed even more. As their hands entwined, and their gazes deepened, the evening took on a different meaning. It wasn't just dinner anymore. It wasn't just two people enjoying each other's company. It was the beginning of something more. Something real. Something that, despite the world around them, was worth every step. The days following Ryan's visit were a blur of introspection and quiet revelations. Margaret had never expected love to come back to her, not like this. Her life had been filled with its fair share of ups and downs, but at her age, she had come to believe that romance was reserved for the young. It was something she had once enjoyed but had slowly pushed aside as the years passed, thinking herself too old for such feelings. And yet, here she was, falling for a man who wasn't just younger than her, but someone whose life was just beginning in ways hers had already passed. The gap between their ages hadn't mattered in the moments they shared. With Ryan, she felt seen, alive, like she was a person worth noticing again, not just an afterthought or a relic of a life lived long ago. At night, when the world outside her apartment was quiet and still, Margaret would lie in bed, her thoughts swirling like a storm. She wondered about the future, about what people might say if they found out. The doubts crept in, whispers of judgment from friends, family, or even strangers. Was it too strange, too unconventional? Was she betraying some unspoken rule of society? She couldn't help but feel the weight of these questions, even though she knew, deep down, that they were just fears. Fear of what others might think had kept her trapped for so many years, and yet, when she thought of Ryan, she couldn't bring herself to care about anything else. She had spent so much of her life wrapped in the familiar monotony of routines. Her work, her solitary evenings, the quiet hum of daily life. She built a life, yes, but it had always been with the shadow of loneliness hanging over it. But now everything had changed. She was waking up to a new chapter, one that felt both exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. Margaret had learned over the years to be cautious with her heart. She had given it away once, in a marriage that ended in quiet resignation, a love that faded with time. But Ryan was different. There was something in him that made her want to be open again. The way he looked at her, how his eyes saw beyond the surface, how he seemed genuinely interested in everything she had to say. He never treated her like she was just an older woman. He made her feel vibrant, relevant, and yes, even desired. One afternoon, as they sat in a small cafe near the park, sipping their coffee in the sunshine, Margaret found herself lost in thought. She watched Ryan as he spoke passionately about something. She couldn't even remember what it was, only the way his eyes lit up when he talked. He had this way of making everything feel important, of making her feel important. He reached over, his hand finding hers on the table, a simple gesture, but one that felt as profound as any spoken word. "You know," he said, his voice warm and earnest, "I don't care what other people think. I just care about this, about us." Those words, so simple yet so genuine, made Margaret's heart swell. She squeezed his hand in return, a silent agreement. She felt the same. In that moment, the fear that had clouded her mind for so long seemed to lift, just a little. It wasn't about age. It wasn't about fitting into some mold. It was about two people, finding something real and meaningful in each other. She had spent too much of her life pretending that love wasn't for her anymore. But now, as she sat there, with Ryan's hand in hers and the soft warmth of the sun on her skin, she realized that real love, wasn't about time or age. It was about the connection that existed between two people, about the courage to embrace that connection, no matter the circumstances. Margaret smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She was no longer concerned with how society would view her, or whether the world would approve of her relationship with Ryan. The doubts, the fears, they all seemed so insignificant now. What mattered was the joy she found in these moments, joy she had nearly forgotten was possible. And maybe, just maybe, this was how life was supposed to be. Love, at any stage, could be beautiful. She had lived through decades of silence, of wondering if the best part of her life was behind her. But now, in the midst of this unexpected love, she realized that the best part of her life was just beginning. As Margaret sat by the window, watching the city bustle below, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for years. The world outside continued its frenetic pace, but in her small corner of it, everything had changed. Love, she had come to understand, didn't have to adhere to any timeline or expectation. It was something that could happen when you least expected it, at any age, in the most unlikely of places. She thought about the way Ryan had transformed her world, how their connection had brought color to her days that once seemed muted by time. It wasn't just the physicality of him that mattered, though that too was undeniable. It was the way he made her feel. Seen, valid, cherished. These were things she hadn't realized she'd been craving, things she'd almost forgotten were possible. There had been moments of doubt, moments when the weight of society's judgment pressed heavy on her chest. She had wondered if this love was foolish, if she was being naive. But every time she looked at Ryan, those doubts faded into the background, drowned out by the warmth of his presence, his laughter, his affection. It wasn't a fleeting feeling. This wasn't some youthful infatuation that would pass with time. It was something real, something deep, and it had awakened parts of her she had long since buried. As she thought about the future, Margaret felt a sense of hope she hadn't known in years. She no longer felt like she was in the twilight of her life. Instead, she felt like she was living in a new dawn, one that held endless possibilities. Love, she now understood, wasn't bound by age. It wasn't bound by anything. It was simply the connection between two souls, the willingness to be vulnerable, to embrace what was beautiful even if it didn't fit into the neat boxes society had constructed. "I don't regret it," she whispered to herself, the words feeling like a weight lifted from her heart. "I don't regret loving him." And as she thought about that, She realized she had a message for anyone who would listen. Age, time, expectations, they were all just constructs. The only thing that mattered in love was the truth of it. If your heart was willing to love, there was no reason to wait, no reason to let fear keep you from what was right in front of you. In the end, it wasn't the years that defined her or her capacity for love. It was the depth of her heart, the willingness to risk it all for something genuine. Ryan had taught her that love could happen at any time, that there was no expiration date on joy, on passion, on the simple act of feeling alive. As Margaret took a deep breath, she smiled. She wasn't just living her life anymore. She was living it with an open heart, ready to embrace whatever came next, without fear, without regret. And for the first time in a long while, she knew that love, in all its forms, had a way of finding you when you needed it most.